Perfect. In which
Good to
case,
go.
I'm hoping that I can actually start presenting as well. So today, what I'm hoping to be able to present is to give you an overview of the records management capabilities in Microsoft 365. I would love to dive in and make it as tangible as possible. Please feel free to stop me for questions. Because I've only got two screens here, I can't actually see your questions. So please, interrupt me and let me know if there is a question that you'd like me to answer at any time.
I will make sure, Robert.
Thank you.
Okay.
So very often when we're talking through the capabilities of records management in Microsoft 365, people want to almost be given a roadmap for how do we actually practically implement all of this. And it's really hard because it really depends upon who you are as an organization, how secure you need to keep your information and the licenses you have available to you. So what I'll try and do is, I think the first stage is to just get a good familiarity with the functionality that's available out of the box, which I'm hoping I can give you in the next 40 minutes or so. And once you're familiar with that functionality, I think you can start making sensible choices for your organization. Now, invariably that doesn't work, so I'm going to have to use the old-fashioned mouse way of clicking through slides. Okay, so I'll just introduce myself for anyone who's not familiar who I am. I'm Rob Bath. I am a Microsoft 365 solution architect. I've done nothing but Microsoft 365 and SharePoint now for, gosh, about 15 years or more. I work for Intelligy. Intelligy is a gold partner based in the UK, just outside of London. We are a systems integrator and we provide services across the breadth of Microsoft 365 and SharePoint. Now, in addition to working for Intelligy, I also volunteer as the Information and Records Management Society's digital director. And I guess this sort of puts me in a bit of a hybrid space, because I've got one foot very firmly in the Microsoft 365 technical stack. I mean, back in the day, I used to be a developer, not a very good one, but I was a developer back in the day. And I've got the other foot firmly in the records management space. And so what I'm really trying to do is pull those two communities together and help explain to the records management community how you can use the Microsoft 365 capabilities, keep you informed about changes, etc., that's going on. And at the same time, I'm trying to drag, if you like, and help Microsoft move the retention capabilities in Microsoft 365 closer to what we're looking to achieve within records management. And again, I recognize there's no easy one-size-fits-all there. So why are we doing this? I think Rob's alluded to some of this already, but obviously compliance is a big thing, but why else specifically are we trying to manage our records? Now, I think most of you on this call will already have answers to this question, but effectively, we're trying to sort the wheat from the chaff. I know it's a bad analogy with a combine harvester there, but what we're trying to do is we're trying to identify the content that we're storing inside Microsoft 365 that is of really high value. And that could be, for example, content that we want to preserve for a future archival. Maybe it's of real importance to our organizations or even of historical value. Or potentially there's content that we need to preserve. For example, content of, let's say, in order to meet legislation or regulations, we need to make sure that, say, our financial records are fairly typically stored for 7 years. I don't think anyone actually, apart from Companies House in the UK, looks at them for the first 7 years, but effectively, most organizations do automatically delete them down after that 7-year period. But there's other reasons that we want to retain things for long term. The analogy I often use is, imagine you get some people around to do some work in one of the buildings that you work in, and they drill through a wall and they hit some asbestos. It's absolutely critical, as I'm sure you'll all be aware on this call, that any information relating to, say, an exposure event like that is well protected. You need to be able to refer back to that in 40, 50, 60 years' time, because let's say they come back through your front door and with a lung condition or something. I know it's a bleak subject, but you would need to be able to evidence everything that you've done in the past. But it's not just about the wheat. The other side of the records management story is also about the chaff. It's a balance of risk between the sort of making sure that content isn't accidentally deleted, but also making sure that the content that you want to get rid of is, because timely deletion is the flip side of the records management coin. And as I'm sure most of you are already aware, certainly every organization I walk in and have a look at least 60, maybe 70% of all of their information that they're storing in Microsoft 365 is just junk. It's redundant, it's obsolete, it's trivial, it's nonsense that needs to go. Not only does this bloat up your environments and start, costing money in terms of storage, but for me, even worse than the financial impact is that it just starts slowing down the experience for users. As they're trying to find content, as they're traversing the site and searching, a whole bunch of just rubbish starts surfacing that they have to wade through to find the information that's actually what they're looking for. And then, of course, as Rob alluded to before, you've got regulations such as GDPR. It's obviously critical that information containing personal information that we no longer have a legitimate need to retain is deleted on a timely basis. So before I dive into the new capabilities, or the relatively new capabilities in Microsoft 365, I thought I'd just look back over our shoulder and look at some of the legacy approaches that some of you are probably already familiar with. The very first approach to managing records in SharePoint was introduced in SharePoint 2010, and this was the Legacy Record Center. What you effectively needed to do was set up a whole bunch of classifications. You typically have more than the three I've got here, but let's just go with these three for the sake of argument, for simulation purposes. And you would tag content with different terms. Now, in a separate space in SharePoint, you'd have a separate site called a record center. And effectively what happens is, almost at an artificial point in time after the end of the document, being a document, and after you're no longer editing it, you'd have this sort of artificial event where individual files could be declared as being records. And when this occurred, you would effectively, they'd be actually moved from the site where they were created, away from the context of all the information they were created with, into the record center, and then grouped functionally for retention. And as you can probably imagine, this works. There's lots of advantages to this sort of approach. From a records manager's perspective, all of your records are now stored in one central location. You can go and have a look, albeit there were a few issues with capacity and URL length. But the biggest issue, I think, for this model, one of the biggest issues, was that you often encountered real headaches when it came to managing permissions. A good example perhaps is with appraisals or PDRs. You can probably imagine they would be created in lots of different spaces, because you'd have different line managers, let's say, storing appraisals in SharePoint in different sort of personal lockdown spaces that are only shared between the line manager and the relevant member of staff. And obviously, if you're picking up all of these appraisals and then moving them into one single central location functionally, because they're all classified as, say, appraisals, you can probably imagine that you'd have real permission issues when it came to who do you give access to that location that you've now moved them to in the record center. And there were solutions to this, but I think that just gives you an indication of some of the complexity that was there with the record center approach. Now, the in-place model for records management appeared in SharePoint in, I think it was 2013, it was first introduced. And the way that in-place records management works is effectively the records are retained in situ across different SharePoint sites. So this is probably more familiar to many people who have started using the more modern retention capabilities that we're going to come on to. But the in-place approach, I think, solved many of the issues that the record center had, although I don't think it was perfect. And I say that because both of these approaches were really complicated to create. You'd have to have dozens, maybe hundreds of information management policies, which were the sort of, I guess, the glue behind this legacy method of records management. And these information management policies would have to be configured in the in-place model in every single SharePoint site that you were creating content in. So you have configuration manually being applied across multiple sites across SharePoint. And that, as you can probably imagine, was complicated, required developers, and tended to be quite expensive. Now, modification as well, maintenance for this was really quite, painful, because something as simple as, I don't know, adding a new term to your file plan, And it would typically require a developer with either of these models, because you'd have to start weaving it, not just into the taxonomy, but you'd have to start weaving it into the actual structures of SharePoint as well. And of course, it's no longer, aligned with Microsoft. It's still fully there in Microsoft 365. It's still something in theory you can use. I would strongly urge you not to use it. Either of these two, record centers are in place. And if you are making use of either of these right now, it's beyond time now to start moving away from them. So time to decommission both of these two legacy capabilities. And this brings us to the modern world. And I say modern, when it was first, they've been around for 5 years now. I think they first came out in 2016, this under the banner Advanced Data Governance, I think it was back at the time. We've slowly picked up a new lane, and that is retention labels and retention policies. I'm sure most of you on this call have probably heard about them. Many of you will probably already be using them to a certain extent. But there's huge differences with this modern approach. The main ones for me are, as Rob kindly mentioned, you've got this central management studio in the compliance center. So instead of having to go across all these different sites and integrate, do lots and lots of custom development, you've got a lot of that gearing centrally managed in the compliance center. So certainly it's much easier to make some of those changes. It's not saying that I'm not saying that you can avoid altogether some of the configuration that you need on the local level. Certainly, if you want to make it nice and easy for your end users, you might well choose to, and I typically would recommend that you sort of do start thinking about local structures inside each site, but not to the extent of limiting how people are using these workspaces. Now, the other thing to mention is that the modern retention capabilities are cross-tenancy. So we're not just looking at SharePoint here. They're moving far beyond SharePoint across the whole of, most of Microsoft 365, and all the time their scope is increasing. Broadly, Microsoft has an in-place model still in the back of their mind. So records are not being moved. The intention is very much that records, whether they are emails in Exchange, whether we're talking about Teams chat, they're retained effectively in situ. That's not always the case, but that's sort of the broad sweeping principle behind the retention capabilities that we currently use. So let's take a look. I'll start with retention policies and just explain what they do at a really high level. So for me, the retention policy is a broad brush approach to retention. It's relatively, certainly compared to the retention label, which I'll come on to in a bit, it's relatively easy to apply. But at the same time, it's I guess it doesn't have the fidelity. It's a fairly sort of, it's so broad that it sort of loses some of its accuracy. Let me try and explain. When you're applying a retention policy, you're applying it to the whole of a major area of Microsoft 365. So for example, you can see here we've got a marketing site in SharePoint that's painted with a blue unclassified comms retention policy. Everything inside that site, irrespective of what it is or where it's stored, in which library, everything is subject to the same retention. The same, for example, you can see here we've got minor project for some reason has been applied to Nadia's Exchange inbox. All of her emails, whether they are highly important decisions that she's making, or whether it happens to be an invitation to the Christmas party, it's all subject to the same retention. Now, retention policies, one of the nice things about them is they're almost invisible from the user perspective. Users don't have to do anything or think about anything. The retention policy is just there in the background, applied to their content. So there's some real benefits from that sort of invisibility from a user perspective. Now, for anyone who's applied or built retention policies at all, you've probably seen this screen, because up until now, static retention policies is the only type of retention policy that we've had. Now, effectively, what this means is the default when you're creating a retention policy is that all of your, say, SharePoint sites or all of your Exchange inboxes would be subject to the same retention policy. You push out the retention policy across all sites. But you notice that we've actually got the ability up here to choose to include or exclude specific areas. So if you're choosing to include something, let's say you'd be able to pick a short list of sites and only push retention policy to those specific sites, or pick a push out, say, a retention policy to all Microsoft 365 groups, but exclude certain specific groups for whatever reason. And this is effectively the way that all retention has to be pushed out. The problem with this is if you want to name, if you want to push out let's say, a retention policy to a specific user's OneDrive account, you've got to name that user. So you've got to actually actively name them as something to include the scope of this retention policy to push them out to. And as you can imagine, for larger organizations, naming lots of users or even naming lots of SharePoint sites can be really quite problematic. And this is where adaptive scopes comes in, because up until now, as I said, we've only had the static application of retention policies. I can't remember quite when they were released, but I think it was only 2 weeks ago they've gone live. So this is really quite still hot off the press. Adaptive scopes provides the current, I guess, best practice way of applying retention policies. I'm quite excited by them. So let's just, I mean, this slide is quite complicated. Let's just zoom in on one part of this slide and try and explain adaptive scopes and how they work. So Lara here. Lara's one-to-one private chat messages are protected by, in this case, the financial retention policy. Now, as I just suggested, with the old-fashioned static application, we'd have had to name Lara individually when we were setting up that retention policy, so that this retention policy could be pushed to Lara's one-to-one chat without it going to other users like Nadia and Ben. But with adaptive scopes, it's a bit cleverer, because effectively we know a lot more about Lara. We know where Lara works. We've got information in Azure Active Directory underneath the scenes to tell us which office she's in or which department she's in. So there's nothing stopping me, for example, using adaptive scopes to set up a rule. Here's the rule that I'm setting up, just a screenshot. I can set up that where anybody's department is equal to payroll. And as you can see, Lara's in the payroll team. I can then, without naming Lara, use adaptive scopes to push out the financial retention policy to her. Now this, to me, this is such a powerful mechanism because it means that the retention policy is dynamic. So for example, if Ben here leaves the legal team and joins payroll, the retention policy will automatically apply to Ben's one-to-one chat as well from this point forwards, because the adaptive scope, without naming Ben, without doing anything configuration-wise, the adaptive scope will just kick in and apply to Ben as well. Now, there's a whole bunch of user attributes that we can use to apply adaptive scopes through. So I've already mentioned department and office as 2 examples, but as you can see that, there's a whole bunch of information that we store in Microsoft 365 against each user. And some of this, like job title or the custom attribute at the end there, is really flexible and really powerful to allow us to, consider different ways that we could build an architecture of adaptive scope-based retention policies and push them out across our environment. And of course, up till now, I've only been talking about this one-to-one chat, but there's other parts of Microsoft 365, a whole bunch of other workloads that actually you could use adaptive scopes to push user-based retention policies onto. So user messages in Yammer, or private channel messages, or email accounts themselves. But of course, users aren't the only thing, the only entity that has an attribute in Microsoft 365. Sites also have metadata against them. You've got the site name, the site URL, and my favorite, the site property bag. The site property bag, for those who don't know, is effectively a hidden classification on all SharePoint sites. And you could, in theory, tag every site when you're creating it, either with a naming convention or in the property bag. And then you could use adaptive scopes to apply the retention policies to the SharePoint sites and OneDrives that happen to be the sites behind them. And then, of course, obviously, if you were to change the metadata or change the name of the site, it would automatically change the retention that's being applied. And the the same happens through the Microsoft 365 group model as well. Got attributes. At the same time, we can apply those attributes to, say, channel messages. So just hold this up for a second. Obviously, the slides will be available later, but I'll hold it up for a second in case anyone wants a screenshot or anything. Okay, let's move on. So retention policies, the life cycle. Effectively, you trigger the start of retention. You can only trigger it based on the first created or last modified. There's no other starting point for the triggering, if you like, of the start of retention with a retention policy. They do not have all of the options that we'll see in a bit about retention labels to allow you to trigger the start of retention. During the retention period, there is all retention policies do is effectively they intercept content when you delete it and automatically sort of catch it and hide it behind the scenes. You can set a retention policy so that they can delete automatically. We'll see that in a second. But what you can't do with the retention policy is prevent modification to content. Content can always be modified. There's no immutability with the retention policy. At the end of retention, there are only two options that you've got currently with the retention policy. You can choose to automatically delete the content that it applies to. So, for example, you can apply 7 years on financial records and automatically delete them down at the end of that duration. Or you can choose to do nothing, which is actually slightly better than it sounds, because what this means is after the end of retention, if do nothing was the end point, if a user happens to delete the file, it will not be caught behind the scenes in that hidden location. The hidden location, I'm going to get the pronunciation wrong here, but it's the preservation hold library in each SharePoint site, or the substrat hold folder in each inbox. So hopefully that's given you a good sort of overview of the retention policy. I like them. I use them in certain circumstances, but I much prefer, I'll be honest, the retention label. And I know that that's a bit controversial because there's always sort of discussions and disagreement between people about what actually good looks like. But for me, I guess my preference is on the retention label side of the story, simply because you've got far more flexibility with what you can do with them, even if they are, I guess, harder to apply in the first place. So let's have a look. With retention labels, again, you set up effectively a file plan of classifications. I say file plan loosely because some file plans I've seen in the past are certainly hundreds, or even I've seen one that was more than 1,000 functional activities sort of listed in this file plan. And that's great, but really with retention labels, you're probably looking at a much smaller file plan than that, a more sort of I guess consolidated list. But a bit like retention policies, you can set up the duration for the length of retention, and you can also have an activity at the end of retention. I'll come on to the activities that we've got available to us in a minute. But what we do with the label policy, retention labels, sorry, is we group them together in label policies. Now, I wish there was a different term for this. Don't confuse label policies with retention policies. Label policies are merely a grouping mechanism for retention labels. You can then associate different parts of Microsoft 365 with a label policy. And let me explain. So if we zoom in, say, just to this Office refurb site here, we've got a SharePoint site here, and it's just been associated with the label policy, which is the project's label policy. So that means that only those two retention labels, the pay and hazardous substances labels, being part of that project's label policy, will be available for users to select to apply to their content inside that Office refurb site. This is quite nice because it means that you get a subset of your file plan effectively available to users in different locations. And you get the ability, if you understand something about the context of the location, you get the ability to give them contextually relevant short list of labels. So they don't have to wade through all of the potential labels in the file plan. Now, just as an aside here, the adaptive scopes that I was just mentioning, when I was getting all excited about the retention policies and the ability to not have to name the individual, I showed you this configuration. those same adaptive scopes that we've got access to also work for these label policy groupings. So this grouping projects, for example, that I just showed you here, the same, you could configure that to pull from, say, metadata, so that it will automatically associate with any site that happens to be tagged in the right way, or any inbox that happens to be, with users from a certain department, for example. And so you could push out the relevant retention label grouping in that mechanism through adaptive scopes as well. And again, that's only a couple of weeks old. So I'm excited to make use of that. I'll be honest, I haven't used adaptive scopes on label policies yet. So label policies yet. So that's a new one for me to look into. Now, to slightly confuse the story here around retention labels, there's actually a whole bunch of different variations of retention labels. The standard retention label that I've been talking about up till now, effectively that, as I've mentioned, you can carry on modifying the file when it's subject to retention with a retention label, but when you delete it, it gets caught and hidden behind the scenes. But you don't have to configure your retention labels in that way. So, for example, the second item on the list here is the deletion label. I don't know if Verica's here. I don't know if you actually call it a deletion label yet officially or not, but the ability to effectively configure a label so that it doesn't retain. It only undertakes the deletion at the end of the deletion period. So let's say you set up a deletion label for something like PII, for a personal information, a PII deletion label could be applied to say 2 years and automatically delete after 2 years. But if anyone chooses to override that sooner, there's nothing in that label that would prevent it from being automatically deleted on a more timely basis if you need to. So deletion labels are really good for things like ROT and PII, where you just want to get rid of content on a timely basis. Whereas retention labels are much better at the content you can't afford to lose. And this brings me to the last two bullet points here, the record label and the regulatory record label. The record label is effectively a variant of the retention label that makes the content immutable. So it locks down the content when it's applied to it and prevents changes. Now, with the record label, you can carry on modifying the metadata that's against the, say, document in SharePoint. But with the regulatory record label, you can't. With a regulatory record label, it's almost like it's quite dangerous in some ways. It's an absolutely permanent marking of immutability against that item. With a record label, you lock it down, no one can change it, but admins can unlock it. So you've got the ability to unlock that file, let's say, and carry on modifying it with a standard record label. But with a regulatory record label, as soon as you apply that label, nobody's going to be able to unlock it. And when I say nobody, not even Microsoft will unlock it. It is permanently locked. So I think the regulatory record label is best to be used sparingly in the hands of people who you really trust to know what it does. So let's have a look at some of the different ways of actually applying retention labels, because I'll be honest, the de facto sort of default way of applying a retention label is the manual application of classification. I mean, I showed you a screenshot just before of a SharePoint site. You could see how, just like any other metadata, it's applied against each item in the document library. Well, if you're anything like me, no one manually tags their content. I mean, there's going to be some exceptions, but typically people, especially if you're using Teams where you can't apply classification yet, you have to jump into the SharePoint site behind the scenes to actually even be able to tag anything manually. The manual application of metadata and retention labels, to me, just doesn't really mesh very well. That's not to say I don't like the manual application, but I think it should be by exception, not by default. In other words, users shouldn't be expected to have to manually label everything, but when they do, when they see something that's mislabeled, this gives them a good opportunity to override that and apply a more appropriate retention label. But there's also a whole bunch of automated approaches here. So the first of these, and cards on the table, this is my favorite. I always try and encourage people to go down the default values line if you can. It requires a premium license, by the way, some of these more advanced capabilities. But if you've got access to, say, E5 or an E3 plus one of the compliance bolt-ons, then you're in a situation where you can set default values on, say, your document libraries or on your folders at the point they're created typically. And that means from that point onwards, all of the content that gets put in, the retention label will cascade down to the content in the relevant area. And that gives you, if you've managed to set up almost contextual classifications on different libraries and different folders, you'll be in a situation where users, almost just by using the workspace that you give them, whether it's Teams or SharePoint, will just find that their content is getting, in theory, quite a relevant classification, quite a relevant retention label, just applied just by their choosing where to store it. We've also got this concept called sensitive information types, which is, I guess, it recognizes strings of characters that are contained within your content. So a good example is, say, a passport number, or in this case, a credit card number, for example. And it will automatically, you can use sensitive information types to automatically apply retention labels to any content that happens to contain something that looks like it has that sort of pattern of characters within it. So sensitive information types, really powerful, really useful at picking up certain types of content. The next automated application of retention labels method that we've got our hands on is the trainable classifier. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with trainable classifiers, I think they're great in certain scenarios. You've got a machine learning based application of retention labels through trainable classifiers. What you need to do is you need to train them with about, I think it's 50 minimum positive examples of a type of content. And so long as you have lots of a type of content that's quite similar, it's worth using trainable classifiers to automatically apply those retention labels. So it works best in scenarios where, say, you've got thousands of very similar types of files. Let's say policies, where you've got several thousand of them. Trainable classifiers are a great way of, at mass across the tenancy, finding them and applying retention labels to them. You've also got keyword query, which is another automated way of applying retention labels. This is, I guess, a bit like, you know, when you're doing a search and you start filtering your search results. The keyword query is almost a bit like that. You're sort of building up a query, if you like, of a way to start drilling into the data. So you might say, I want to find all of the content that contains this exact phrase, or all of the content that's been tagged with this bit of SharePoint metadata, or both of those two in composite, to really get down to a specific subset of your information so that you can apply a retention label to it automatically. Really powerful in the right scenario. I don't think it's ever going to give you the blanket coverage, and you know, it will always leave gaps. This is why I tend to prefer default values as the core, with some of these others as supplementary, but it's still really useful when you're wanting to identify a specific type of content in a specific scenario. And hot off the press, keyword queries have just been, Erica actually put a blog post up. I don't know if you're on the call yet, Erica, but there was a blog post that went out about 24 hours ago now. So Microsoft's just announced that sensitivity labels are now going to be associated with keyword queries. In other words, if you've got a sensitivity label applied to your content, you could use the keyword query capability to basically say, apply a retention label only where a specific sensitivity label's already been applied. So a really powerful extra new capability that I've never been able to talk about before. And finally, the last automated way of applying a retention label is through SharePoint Syntax. SharePoint Syntax has been with us for about a year now, and it's an automated metadata capture technology that almost processes your content through, again, it's through AI, but it processes your content and it finds relevant metadata that you've set it up to look for, and it extracts it so that you can then more easily search, filter, and query all of your content. But if the AI through SharePoint Syntax gets a positive identification of the type of content you're looking for, you can again use it to apply a retention label to that content. So it's really good if you've got, again, quite similar content, but in this scenario where you're processing it, perhaps you already have need to extract metadata on a regular basis. So let's look at the end of the process then, because One of the things that we've got access to with the retention label, you'll notice with the retention policy, we only had two ways of ending. There was the do nothing ending, or there was the automated deletion ending at the end of a retention. With retention labels, you've also got the ability to undertake a disposition review. And the way that Microsoft 365 does this is there's a central sort of pending dispositions area inside the compliance center. And content from all across your tenancy that's got to the end of its retention, nothing happens to it while it's over there in the tenancy, but it all starts bubbling up in a separate list in this pending dispositions area, allowing you to monitor it. When I say you, really I'm talking about different groups of reviewers. So up until fairly recently, you've only had one group of reviewers who would be able to sit there and centrally in the whole tenancy review all of the content that's pending disposition. But that's changed. We've recently had, over the last 6 months, the introduction of multi-stage disposition, which takes this single step of review and allows us now to have up to 5 stages of review at the end of the life cycle for each record. Now, you don't have to have 5. You could certainly have less. You could have 1 or 3. It really doesn't matter. But you can define now quite a complicated process at the end of disposition to meet the needs that you've got. So let me try and explain how this works. So at any of these stages, it doesn't have to be the first, but it can be any of these stages. If one of the reviewers chooses to relabel the file or extend the file, relabel the retention label, which basically is to apply a new retention label to that item that's to that record, or to extend retention on that record, then it will stop that process automatically, because effectively relabeling it, the retention that's subject to the new label will kick in instead. And if you're extending it, it's almost a pause button. You're almost saying, freeze this for another 12 months. I know it's meant to be due for, disposition review now. Let's freeze it for another year or 2 and come back to this one for whatever reason. But this means that anyone at any stage who chooses to relabel or extend, it will stop the process. It won't pass it through to the next set of reviewers. The only way that it passes through from one set of reviewers to the next is if you choose to dispose. And effectively, choosing to dispose won't automatically delete the item until the last set of reviewers chooses to dispose. And only then will it invoke the deletion process. Whether that last set of reviewers happens to be, say, in this scenario, in the 5th stage, whether, let's say you've only got 3 stages, it's always the last stage where deletion will actually be triggered. But for me, this isn't really, I guess, what excites me most about multi-stage disposition. What excites me is, as I mentioned before, up until now, we've only had the ability to undertake disposition review with one central team across the whole tenant. With multi-stage disposition, we now all have the ability to almost choose, create different review groups so that different content from different parts of our tenancy can be moved to be reviewed by different groups of reviewers. I think this is really powerful because, especially for complex organizations where you have, say, there's so many organizations I work with where there are multiple organizations all in the same tenancy, or even organizations where they're sort of arm's length organizations where there's almost departments that are almost autonomous from each other, where in the past that having a single central review group really didn't work for them. And they needed to be able to delegate that disposition review. Well, effectively, the way this works is you need different groups of retention labels for each different group of reviewers. But so long as you've seeded this in your architecture, when you're thinking about which retention labels do I want to push out to which spaces in Microsoft 365, you can bring in this concept of having different groups of reviewers for different parts of your content.
Rob, just
yes.
Notice on time. We have a few more minutes, and then we. So Erica is already in. So
hi, Erica.
Not sure how long you need.
I'll wind up fairly soon. I've only got about 3 more slides, so I'll finish up.
Thank you very much.
Quickly.
Great.
Yeah, no problem. This is great information. Thank you, Rob.
Well, do correct me if I said anything wrong, Erica. So looking at the life cycle then for retention labels, effectively, they've got the same capabilities at the start of retention that the retention policies have, but in addition to first created and last modified, we've also got unlabeled, which I find really useful in certain scenarios. Like I recently used it to allow me to start retention when one item superseded another. So you'd almost, manually apply a new label when it's superseded, and you could then start the retention period from that superseding event. And the last one here, event-based retention, is brilliant. I mean, I could speak for an hour on this alone as a topic, so don't worry, I'm not going to. But event-based retention, I used this great effect with the university recently, and it's really powerful when you've got sort of groups, I guess, events inside your organization, like projects coming to an end, or properties being sold, or in the university's case, it was academic years coming to an end. And so long as you seed the extra ID, the project ID or the property ID or the academic year, onto all your content as well as the retention label, you've got the ability to basically trigger the start of retention on that event. I love it. During retention, you'll notice a slight change here from the when you were looking at the retention policies. You've also got the concept of immutability. So with the record label and the regulatory record label, as I was mentioning before, you've got that ability. And at the end of retention, as I've just mentioned, you've also got the disposition review capability. So effectively, retention labels, I would suggest, have all the advantages of retention policies. They might be a bit harder to apply, and obviously users can see them, but you've got a wealth of extra capabilities with the retention label that you just don't have access to with the retention policy. So why do people use retention policies? Or why do I use retention policies? Because I still do use them. And the answer to that is, well, there's several answers, but one of them is scope. I mean, retention policies have a much broader scope of coverage across Microsoft 365 than retention labels do. So I always use retention policies to sort of fill in all the gaps where I can't use retention labels. But that's not the only thing I use them for. I often use them, for example, in OneDrive I use very often retention policies to automatically delete down content after, say, 18 months, and give retention labels to users to override that, so they can apply longer retention if they want to specific files they want to keep. So there's certainly use for both, I think. I wouldn't suggest most organizations should look at one or the other exclusively. So I'll wind up there.